the interest of time, we should get started today. So good afternoon and welcome to the Prentice Institute Speaker Series. I am Andrea Cuellar, Associate Director of the Prentice Institute, and I'm very happy to introduce us to the talk today. I would like, however, to begin by acknowledging the territory from where we are gathering today. Okay, and welcome to the University of Lethbridge. Our university's Blackfoot name is Iniskim, meaning Sacred Buffalo Stone. We are located in traditional Blackfoot Confederacy territory, and we honor the Blackfoot people and their traditional ways of knowing and caring for this land, as well as all Indigenous peoples who have helped shape and continue to strengthen our university community. The Prentice Institute for Global Population Economy has a mandate to examine big picture issues related to global population changes with a broad historical framework, while also connecting local and regional changes with similar global trends. The Institute contributes to the development of evidence-based policy options to guide Canadians and their governments in addressing some of the difficult challenges facing the world. We are pleased to be joined today by Dr. John White, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute, whose work seeks to reconfigure biodiversity science through decolonial biocultural data integration. John obtained his PhD in anthropology from Tulane University in the US. His doctoral research carried out in the Ecuadorian Amazon was funded by the US National Science Foundation and a Fulbright Fellowship, and he was a research fellow at Harvard University before joining us at the Institute. Dr. White is developing ethnobiodiversity informatics as a methodological framework for linking biological, cultural, linguistic, archaeological, and ecological data sets so that different disciplines and knowledge traditions can tag, annotate, and analyze evidence on their own terms, while also identifying disparities in data access, data use, and interpretive authority across disciplines and cultures, fostering collaborative research across communities in the social and natural sciences. The title of his talk today is Indigenous Climate Reasoning, Causal Models, and Ecological Change in Amazonia. John will speak for 35 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. This talk is being recorded for the Prentice Institute Archive, so please join me in welcoming John today.
Okay, well, welcome everybody, and thank you, Andrea, for that introduction. I'm John White, and I will be talking about some causal models of ecological change seen through Indigenous perspectives and worldviews. This seems pretty straightforward, but what we've seen in a lot of the literature that I'm about to tell you doesn't really mesh with Indigenous peoples as theorizers, right, and contributors to overarching theory and biodiversity science. There's still a very predominant extractivist tendency in many knowledge traditions, be they social or biological. Today, first, I'm just going to expand on what Andrea discussed about our positionality and collaborators in the context of Indigenous researchers as colonial settlers working in working in lands that we are non-Indigenous to. And then I'll overview some of these research questions, settings, methods, and approaches before we get to the positionality. Sorry, it looks like I have a little botch line right there. Before we get to this Indigenous theories of climate change, and plants as indicators, as well as these divergent experiences, which, as you see, are going to be very important because not everybody experiences climate change the same. And this isn't just a factor of where we come from geographically, but also where we come from culturally and socioeconomically. So first, just a quick comment about my positionality. I am a non-Indigenous researcher, and it needs to just be stated that our interpretation of the data, right, is situated within these ongoing settler colonial power asymmetries. And as much as we try to tackle these asymmetries, we never really can, right? It's always going to be one-sided until we have a massive paradigm shift. It still stands to reason, however, that these errors and misinterpretations consequently are our own, and we always welcome correction and continued guided dialogue. We're not here to tell you about yourselves or anyone about the culture that we've explored that is not our own. And just a real quick shout out before I get to the meat and potatoes to our collaborators, of which we have many in the community of Mondiaku, specifically Ernesto Tangila, Dali, Watatoka, and Dalila Alvarado, and Janeth Greffa, as well as several major institutions, be it the Quijos Institution, Federation of Mondiaku, Prentice Institute, and Nick Yarmy for their cartographic work, as well as several major herbaria for the ever critical voucher specimen collection and transportation. All right, so in a nutshell, the research questions we were exploring, right, is Indigenous climate change using causal and integrated? What we mean by that, right, is there's often this tendency or trope in a lot of disciplines to view knowledge from Indigenous peoples as kind of simply observational or one-off ideas that can be taken away and applied to exterior models. What we wanted to look into, we had a strong suspicion that this wasn't the case for a variety of reasons, was that Indigenous peoples actually, in many cases, have their own theories. In many cases, akin, in many ways, to our own scientific theories about things like drivers, right? As well as affects and effects of climate change. So the research setting, as Dr. Cuellar pointed out, is in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Basically south of Quito and east of the Andes Mountains, there's a large reserve known for its biological and cultural diversity called the Sumaco Reserve, right? Sumaco Bioreserve. And this area has just this really unique history of being in this intermontane zone, right? Of two extremely contrasting environments, the Andes, right, and the Amazon. Not only that, we see divergent and varying cultures, right, adapted to both of those areas, intermingling, right? So we have this intermingling gradient of culture and biological diversity that makes this area very interesting to study when we're talking about changing climate, right? Biology is interrelated to physiology, to geology, right, as it is to the climate in and of itself. And part of these variations can help explain what people's experiences of climate change and the effects of climate change are different. We did this research in 2023 through 2025 about as part of my PhD research at Tulane University. Grant money kept kind of trickling in, so it carried on a bit longer than we thought it would. But a real quick discussion about our methodologies this was pretty much just a straightforward ethnographic research project vis-a-vis cultural anthropology with an added layer of ethnobotany on top of it. My MSc was in ethnobotany at the University of Kent at Canterbury with Kew Botanical Gardens. And I started to quickly realize that biologists and many natural scientists' interpretations of different cultures beyond their own were kind of holding back collaborative research as well as cross-disciplinary research. Specifically, not just in climate change, right? But in studies of biodiversity and what we're terming the Anthropocene, right? Today, we're starting to see these accumulated changes of specific cultures and specific types of ways of living in the world, wreaking havoc on the world in ways we've never seen before, right? Many people have words for this. The word we kind of use and is in globalized discourse, which many Indigenous peoples are part of now. Very important to not romanticize these individuals as, some savage group without access to the internet or cell phones. That's not the case. Even in some of the most remote areas that I've worked, such as in Yasini National Park with the Waorani, they have cameras and cell phones. So they're familiar with this term climate change, right? And in many cases, since kids are exposed to globalized schooling, they may be familiar with drivers, right? Or effects of climate change as seen through the globalized lens. Our talk obviously blended these more contemporary ideas with potentially more antiquated or traditional ideas. It's difficult to separate tradition from contemporary knowledge, right? And often I would argue that sometimes it's not necessarily the thing that's the most important thing to focus on. What we can say is that we interviewed a variety of age demographics. I forget what our oldest was, 86 to 16, in a variety of contexts, ranging from just gardening throughout the day as I spent my participant observation with these chadra mamas or women working in gardens who are known for their gardening abilities, all the way to conducting semi-structured interviews or structured interviews in more formalized settings, such as in community centers or in households. The idea here, though, is that all of these participants that I was working with, in some capacity, reported climate change, even if they didn't use the word climate change, right? And have been familiar with it for many generations, at least reportedly. So when we talk about our divergent experiences, right, specifically sometimes along those age gradients, older generations often didn't use the word climate change, but they would maybe lament that the growing and agricultural conditions had dramatically shifted. There may have not been as much normal rain or temperature patterns shifting, as well as a common indicator, use of bioindicators, which is to say a use of plants evidencing changes in climatic factors, right? This plant no longer yields as much as it used to yield. This plant now yields much earlier in the year. This plant no longer yields. These are common quotations that I heard in my research. The idea here, though, is that the divergent experiences that are reported, right, even though many people reported that there were rain and temperature patterns, I think we have 20 here saying yes, right, with what is this, 26 saying, or 20, 25, 20 saying yes and 5 saying no. These divergent experiences aren't necessarily contradictions, which was often kind of what I ran into when I was talking with a lot of biologists, right? They would say, all right, well, we haven't standardized the methodology in which you're asking these questions. Well, of course, right? These people haven't lived in the same area throughout their whole life. So the questions we're asking about changes in temperature and rain aren't directly comparable. However, this doesn't mean, right, that the evidence, right, isn't still useful or impactful in some ways, right? And the reason for this is varied. So this was just a follow-up question, right? I didn't want to necessarily lead with asking people, has the climate changed, right? Or whether or not rain and temperature patterns have changed. Before I committed to participant observation, it was only after several people kind of pointed out, right, and lamented these changes in crop schedules that I started to inquire about some of these variations in climate. The idea, though, was that there was a plurality of reported variations and a plurality, right, of reported causal domains, which is just to say triggers. These aren't just old people, even 88-year-olds weren't just like, oh, the climate's changed. Oh, well, right? They are thinkers and theorizers, like humans have been, right, since we've evolved, right, from our hominid ancestors. They theorize about factors that may cause climate change, may cause shifts in rainfall or cause shifts in wind. Things like deforestation, right? Or things like excessive use of plastic or pollution. These weren't just localized around young kids in schools, right? This was a common trope among old men at bars, talking about how cross-cutting of forest for palm plantation has destroyed soil integrity, right? Irreparably, so that they can't grow things that their great-grandparents used to grow in the same exact areas. And that the reason for this, right, isn't just the deforestation practice itself, it's the companies that are driving the deforestation, right? These multi-causal chains in which they're saying this is a social cause, right, related to a biological outcome, right, which is now creating a further abiotic cause, climate change, which is subsequently causing further cultural problems. And that's when something kind of clicked. These abuelas and abuelos, 88-year-olds, were in many ways ahead of a lot of our biggest theorizers in the sciences that want to separate biological and cultural aspects from one another, right? Certainly in these causal chains, right, or cycles. So something needed to give, right? Especially if we want to move forward, not only in decolonial research, right? Thinking about histories of developing theories, not just concentrated around Greek and Rome and white rich men, right? But in backyards and forests, and old women's gardens, right? And in pretty virtually anywhere that humans roam, now and in the past. And it's these linking of these causal domains with multiple outcomes, right? That science today is now keying in on and changing and adapting their protocols, right, in the current Anthropocene. So we saw things like anthropogenic drivers, pollution, oil is a big one. Ecuadorian Amazon sits on a vast reserve of oil. Yay. Unfortunately, it may be a matter of time, right, before we see some similar political actions that we're seeing in Venezuela occur in Ecuador. However, they're very much aware, right? This is a huge source of income for all of these people and has been for generations, right? They are aware why deforestation is happening. Right? And they're aware of the causes, and they're aware of the subsequent causes, such as climate change potentially limiting their agricultural yields, right? This isn't to say, however, that there aren't a number of individuals with different opinions, or to say that some of those maybe anthropogenic or biological or geophysical drivers weren't linked to other factors, like spiritual causality, right? A spirit did this. Or let's say, I don't know, maybe this is just a natural cycle, right? Something that's not necessarily driven by a human. This is often pointed to as a reason not to collaborate or utilize knowledge from indigenous peoples. But we see this type of knowledge, this type of spiritual rationality every single day in some of the quote unquote greatest nations on planet Earth. Don't worry about climate change. It's just, I don't know, something that's caused by God's will, right? The idea here is that we can extricate and analyze, right? Sometimes you get young kids claiming a spiritual cause, but they're saying God is acting or punishing through pollution, right? They're still aware that the pollution is the vector, right? That is poisoning them, right? And it may just be God or a spirit or other non-human supernatural entity stimulating it or exacerbating it in some ways. Which is to say that we can treat these as coexisting explanations that aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, especially if we want to move forward in collaborative endeavors. These are just some of these direct quotations that I pulled from to make these radar charts. So throughout all of our interviews and subsection of the relevant semi-structured interviews on climate change, we analyzed people's direct quotations and then coded them, right, for common themes, things like plastic, pollution. And then we analyzed those in relation to the amount of times that they occurred, right, in those sonar or radar charts right here. This is subjective, right, but it also allows us to preserve our data integrity, right, which is to say that throughout all parts of our data collection, we can point to the data that we've used, how we've analyzed it, right, and how we've operationalized it, which is essential for maintaining, right, those indigenous people's roles as theorizers, right? Not just saying it's a, extranjero, it's some white guy looking at what they're saying and thinking that they're talking about climate change. As I was saying before, one of these most common metrics for analyzing climate change and thinking about it, especially I think in terms of a population that's predominantly agrarian, right? Which is to say a population that subsists on food that they themselves often grow, if not exclusively anymore. Many of them are participating in wage labor, often by necessity. Ever since there have been laws that have been changed to require school uniforms for children, right? You can't just work in your garden, right? Because you can't grow plastic to weave a school uniform that's required to send your kid to school. So to some degree, right, there may be variations in the amount of exposure children or individuals have with these plant indicators, but almost everyone pointed to a plant indicator when discussing how the climate was changing, right? Or how the climate would change and how the climate change would impact them or has impacted them in the future, right? So it's it's often either some abiotic factor, right? Rain, heat, lack of rain, right? Too much wind, but tied into these chains of causality, right? They're keenly aware often of these multiple factors that are tied into ecosystems and that result in their current situations. So if they speak about rain changing or climate getting colder, they might say that this is contributing to, I don't know, the development of a fungal growth, like a cow tree, such as witch's brew, right? So it's these multiple causal chains that are particularly interesting because they stand to inform a lot of the biological and social sciences, not just in history and philosophy, but in biocultural diversity and agronomy, right? Some of these data points, right, could inform things like plant breeding, right, or indigenous philosophy, for instance. So when they were talking about how they would view a changing climate, right, and evidence their theories about a changing climate, like I said, it was mostly through plants. So they would act in many ways as these bioindicator anchors. I think this is often because plants don't move, right? Or most plants don't move. Trees in particular were utilized, and a parent, right, might point out to their kid as they're young and saying, this tree fruits in the rainy season. And then when the kid goes to teach his own kid about that tree, all of a sudden it's not fruiting in the rainy season, and cognitive disconnect, right? The plant is evidencing some sort of change in an environment. So be it through declining yields or early fruit drop, shortened lifespans of plants, the list is very long. Often a common one was just they don't grow the same, or fruit declines, or they're getting less yields, right? Some plants like Indigenous, those baby bananas, they were able to get multiple yields within a single season. And now they may not. Obviously, some of this may not be tied to climate change, right? That's not what the study was examining. The study is trying to evidence and look at how Indigenous peoples develop theories about how factors influence other forms of biota and environments. So why this matters, right? As I've tried to kind of evidence in a number of ways, is that if we're going to truly collaborate with people who have diverse opinions, opinions that are dramatically diverse from ourselves, right? And we have to, right? Because it's happening all around the world in the biggest countries and the richest countries currently today, right? Some people outright deny climate change and say, I don't know, it's a spiritual issue, right? Other people point to the fact that it's anthropogenic. There has to be this recognition, right, for multiple viewpoints, and just valuing diverse opinions, especially when it comes to Indigenous peoples who are critically underrepresented as it is. They control and steward something like 25% of our planet's surface, constitute about 5% of our global population, around that, maybe 29% of our land surface, I forget. Don't quote me on that exactly. Yet they're so disproportionately affected by the outcomes, be it economically, right, in terms of their job securities or how they feed themselves, in terms of subsistence wise, right, the foods as they grow and they're depending upon are starting to fail before their eyes. But it's deeper because there's also these decolonial tropes, as I've said, in numerous sciences, in numerous histories that view Indigenous peoples, right, as somebody who has knowledge, right? We've moved into that world. They're not just people who don't have knowledge, but somehow they're just knowledge holders, right? Knowledge that can be taken and used by larger sciences. I argue that that's not the case. And I think if many people just examined what their implications of what they're saying, they would also realize that's not the case. Because it's an inherently decolonial idea, right? That isn't useful, right? Doesn't move us forward in collaboration with people who are different from ourselves, be it within a country like America, or be it as differently as somebody in a chakra or in a garden in Amazonia, right? You have to focus on specifically these underrepresented groups, though. The Indigenous peoples certainly can't be ignored in the Anthropocene. As I've said, 25%, that's about a quarter. And it's not just a quarter of the most useless land. It's about a quarter of some of the most important land for our biosphere in terms of the biodiversity that we depend on for drugs, medicine development, to atmospheric processes like rain, right, and cleaning air. But the biggest thing here is if we're going to tackle this, right, we need to start bringing together all these diverse sciences. To kind of bring it back to what I was saying at the beginning, right, when I was starting to realize that a lot of these Indigenous elders and old people were in many ways ahead of what a lot of our biological scientists that I've been speaking to and collaborating with in terms of their linking of cultural and biological phenomenon and multi-causal chain integrations, is that we have to be able to collaborate across disciplines and cultures, right? And in order to do that, I think it's going to require viewing everybody, right, in this potential contributor of a theory framework. So I know I ended a little early. I probably rushed through that. We have a half an hour left for questions, I guess. But these are the mandatory supported grants, a few extra ones that I'll get in trouble if I don't mention. But I'm super happy to field questions about this because I understand it's a rather nebulous topic, but it is an important one. So I'm not sure if we should just go to questions or if anybody has any questions. If anyone in the room has any
Question. I'm wondering how the participants attributed like Western industry and Western role in all of the changes.
So the question was how participants in the study in Ecuador interpreted a lot of these globalized or Western, translocutors or probably, industrialized corporations. And it's mixed, right? As you can imagine anywhere, right? Just like in America and certainly in Michigan and Alberta, right? And in Georgia, right? We talk about oil and it's a polarizing concept, right? Some people are like, well, it's how my family makes a living. And other people are like, well, they're not going to make that living for much longer and you're destroying a living for everyone else. This is basically how I found most of the participants in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Most of them are employed in some capacity, have been employed in some capacity, or know somebody employed in some capacity by the oil industry. Shell, Exxon, I'm not sure, Shell Mara rather. So it's hard to get necessarily, even when I've worked with them for 2 years, and many of these people I've known for decades. I've worked in for a decade. I've worked in the region for about 12 years. So it's not necessarily a question of rapport, right? Or getting in trouble with their boss. They really do, look at this as what would I do without this source of income into my life, right? How would I send my kid to school, right? Ecuador actually has a surprisingly excellent healthcare system, but nevertheless, right? What if you need some sort of surgery that they don't specialize in, right? Like cancer, for instance. These are all too common, especially in the Ecuadorian Amazon oil extraction regions, where we know petrochemicals leak into the groundwater, right, and contribute to heightened rates of cancer, which I've also heard people blame the petrochemical industry for in Ecuador. So it's a complicated question. I think they know it's complicated. When Ecuador, I forget what year it was, basically held their basically made an appeal to the world and said, look, we have a whole bunch of oil, right? Unfortunately, it's below one of the most biodiverse areas on planet Earth. Can you, as a nation, right, as the nations of planet Earth, get together and pay us money, right? Because this is our natural resource. You all have a whole bunch of other natural resources, right, which you've extracted. And as the world has changed, right, this is one of our only ways to keep abreast. So we are going to take it if nobody else is going to help us. A few nations got some money together for them, but ultimately the extraction went forward. The obvious argument was, so what happens when the next regime change happens, right? The next president comes and wants to do that again and again and again and again. I don't know, maybe we should keep paying them. Maybe not. It's a complicated question, as were most of their relationships with the oil industry. Any other questions?
Yeah, so interesting presentation. Yeah, my question close to previous. So you mentioned earlier that investigators are non-indigenous researchers. So and research took place in Ecuador. So how do you deal with the language indigenous? Again, to translate, because you talk about coding.
Absolutely. So it's a great question.
Yeah. Do you code first in indigenous and translate into English, or how do you deal with that? Can you share a bit with it?
Absolutely. So it's a variety of answers as are most of these things. So I actually speak Quechua, their indigenous language. Yeah, and I have been learning it pretty much since I went down there. And my first time learning it was a decade ago in Ecuador, and then I went down there every summer and have been down there every summer. I met my wife there. And I now have a newborn baby girl as of about 40 days ago. So that's a big change in my life. Yes, but most of the participant observation, I learned Quechua before I learned Spanish. I think Quechua is just due to its word order, subject, object, verb is in many ways, I don't know, more akin to English than Spanish. And I speak Spanish. I'm not nearly as fluent as Quechua, and I get in trouble for it a lot. I speak Quechuanol, as do many Quechua people, right? Their kids often speak a blend of Spanish, English, or Quechua, or many people might only be able to listen or hear. But to get at the core of your question, the participant observation in my daily life most of the time was interacting in Quechua or in Spanish, or Quechuanol, as they say. The satellite charts in particular were collected via a semi-structured interview with an Indigenous collaborator. So we worked together to develop a series of semi-structured questions. We said, how are these going to be presented in Spanish, right? How are they presented in English? And what are these kind of nuances in between some of these words? We started in Quechua to ask some of the questions, but we quickly found that due to some of the, I guess, knowledge gaps in younger generations, right? Kids didn't speak Quechua, so they would respond to us in Spanish, right? Which, as you're pointing out, would have made some very large problems, perhaps, for our topical coding, right? For instance, when we talk about listing of domains in Spanish, right? If I were to say, name the medicinal plants and just write down a list, we would get different lists from the same people if we said, we write down all of the plants in Quechua, right? It triggers a different cognitive domain. So we were really careful to try to apply that same sort of logic to how we topically coded those scatter charts. But it is subjective, yes.
Yeah, great.
Any other questions?
Yeah, thanks. This was a very stimulating talk. I'm curious, in terms of people's everyday discourses, they're talking about climate change as something, more macro sense, that changing kind of in one direction over a long period of time? Or were they talking more in terms of variabilities that sort of happen in unpredictable ways as they have for a long period of time? I ask because I work in East Africa and I did some interviews with climate change. And there seem to be two schools of thought there. One, there was a fair number of people that were saying, yes, there's less rainfall, there's more frequent drought than when I was young. But there were also a surprising number of people who kind of said, no, that's not really the case. We've always had droughts, we've always had environmental variabilities. And I see, for instance, by way of comparison in the Amazon basin, the forest gardening techniques, for instance, to me represent a way for people to deal with the variability, environmental variabilities that they have to deal with in their everyday lives. They can't just rely on finding the plants that they want, so they actively plant them as a way to
absolutely
deal with that. I was curious about that. If there's sort of more of a meta-narrative, how we kind of imagine it in our global discourse around climate change, or whether it's more of an unpredictable set of variabilities.
So a whole bunch. And once again, just to preface, I think our sample size of this was about 60 individuals, and I think only 30 consented to the subsequent analysis. So we don't have a large sample size, as many cultural anthropological studies go. A reason for this sometimes is rapport building, right? It takes a while to talk to people and get to a point where they feel like you're not an extractive colonel trying to just take and take. But also just because virtue of moving around, right, is difficult, often in places like Africa or in Ecuador for a variety of reasons, weather, terrain, protest, government, you name it. But yeah, there's a lot of divergent experiences, which I think, and were reportedly explained through a number of factors, right? Some were just people disagreeing, right? Two brothers in particular. So we know that they were raised together and functionally experienced, to the degree possible, the same environment, right? They were arguing about whether or not it was warmer or hotter now, and they could not agree. So we're going to see that no matter what, right? I think in the data sets. We would have to do a much larger analysis, right? With a lot more careful controls, I think, to suss out whether or not these people are observing something necessarily that is like an extreme weather event, right? Based on their environment. For instance, some of the people are on the tops of hillsides, right? So it would make sense, perhaps, if they're saying it's more windy, right? Because they're experiencing an uninterrupted avenue for wind that is increasing to strike them from. that said, there's also these kind of climate culture interaction zones, right? So if you were richer than your brother, for instance, right, and your brother was poorer, and one year, because it was too hot, you had a crop failure, right? You would remember that as a hotter year. Your brother might not, right? Uh, so these economic, cultural, right, because that's just one aspect of culture, that economic example. There's innumerable ones that we probably don't have time to get into that can affect what's going on here, how we're collecting the data, and how we can ultimately operationalize it and what for. But that's a great question, and I'd be interested in talking to you about it.
I know that this wasn't the focus of your research, but do you have any awareness of the education system and how, what students are learning in terms of climate change and how that influences their understanding? And is there like any kind of a generational difference in understanding based on formal learning?
Absolutely, and just shout out to my partner and wife, Dr. Lauren Dodaro, because she works more on the intergenerational exchange of environmental knowledge. But I did analyze this, obviously, just because I was interested in how the data would vary across age categories. Mundiyaku actually is kind of unique in terms of a lot of communities in Ecuador and many indigenous communities worldwide, insofar as that they have a school in their community in which they do a portion of their education in Quechua. To my understanding, it may be different orthography, or there may be nuanced differences in how the language, how the linguistics of the language are formalized, Quechua unificado or otherwise. But there's going to be discourse that comes from a globalized Ecuadorian government because they receive Ecuadorian funding, right? If you're getting money from the state, you have to adhere to state level protocol, right? Which we're seeing in the United States and many other places right now, right? So they're going to hear about things like globalized drivers of climate change, especially with Ecuador, right? Being very environmentally focused and giving rights to their environment, right? And huge world first kind of movements. In terms of divergences, that's a little difficult. I think I would need, specific inquiries into it. I didn't really analyze a lot of differences between parents, teaching to their children and the schools teaching to their children, only because I didn't have permits to get in and work with school children. That was going to be like a whole other aspect. I would have loved to, though. Did I answer your question? Anyone online?
Maybe we need to see the chat and
Oh, we got 8. No, God, I thought that was participants. Sonia, all right, here. Let me see if I can unmute. Oh wait, no, that's Sonia just saying she can see the PowerPoint. Is there any other questions or thoughts, comments?
I have kind of sorry, Andre.
No, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, this was kind of a more technical question. I was admiring your charts there. You called them the radar charts, was it?
Yeah, I think it's radar. Sonia would chime in. She was the one that informed me.
Is that essentially just showing kind of the frequency at which themes came up during interviews, and it's sort of
Exactly, right? So these are these topically coded categories, right, that I looked at the quotations and said this one mentions plastic, this one mentions warmer, right, this one mentions, and then assign it and then score the frequency, and then you can just auto plot that to show kind of where the spread of the data is.
Yeah, I like that. I hadn't seen that, but I've been trying to figure out ways to keep that.
This is an automatic function now on virtually every PowerPoint. I think in the last update on Windows and Google Slides should now have radar charts as an auto plot function.
Great,
Thank you, John, and thank you for discussing all of the subtleties entailed in gathering that information, in interpreting and making sense of what it means in terms of kind of like one response or multiple responses. And so I totally get that. The question of the theorizing about climate change made me think, and it's partly on things that I've heard over there as well, on how they theorize about responses to climate change and climate change mitigation. Did you cover that aspect?
Yeah, so not to as big of a degree, because basically the amount of data that I was getting basically was kind of exploratory and this was a kind of subsequent chapter that emerged out of my fieldwork experiences. Had I had more time, I would have loved to have their inputs on it. But some people were wildly different, right? Oh, it doesn't really matter if I'm extracting gold from a river using an engine that spits the extake of the engine's diesel back into the river. It's just a drop, right? And if this river's bad, there's more rivers, right? Or other common ones that we would hear. Well, yeah, I know I'm deforesting this area that I ate, and that the globalized maybe palm industry or oil industry is deforesting these areas I eat, and that's causing the loss of game animals. This was a common thing. That, look, all right, we need to do something. And we're not able to hunt these animals anymore, and Ecuador is imposing laws about it. The often kind of response to it was, well, don't worry. There's always more land we can go to, right? The game animals will be somewhere else. And this is meshed with other researchers that I know, Jimmy Beveridge, for instance, and several other kind of Amazonianists that have spoken to kind of the disappearance or decline of biodiversity as not necessarily jiving with globalized discourse and how that impacts, like you said, responses to climate change. For instance, if you think all of the fish in a polluted river, or all the deer in a deforested palm plantation are just moving somewhere else, right? And not dying, right? And as a result, will always be able to be recovered and reutilized, right? That's different, right? From what may be the actuality, the species going extinct, right? Then followed by the cultural practice having to adapt or change. So it was varied. The responses that I did hear were mixed. Some people were advocating for lack of deforestation. We need to get up there and stop them from burning and poisoning our rivers due to gold extraction, the petrochemical industry. Other people, though, were just, no, it doesn't really matter. The Earth's huge, right? Our government says this is okay. Why would they lie to us? Eerily similar to how, I see many world governments and people all over the world addressing these major issues of climate change and biodiversity. Which may be no surprise, right? They are just people.
Are you collaborating with local governments or government in general, especially agricultural departments, on how to mitigate the fact that some of these plants do not produce the way they used to? Are they breeding other plants that can adapt to climate change?
Yeah, this is a huge and actually a major kind of reason I got into this type of biocultural research in the beginning to start with is through crops and crop wild relative research and addressing food insecurity as a result of climate change. One of the other collaborators on this and who I partnered with, Alvaro, I love it. Don't be forgetting your last name right now. I'll remember in a second. I've known him for a decade. He'll forgive me. Has worked at INEA, which is exactly what Ecuadorian's governmental organization is. That is the government organization assigned to address those issues, right? The collection of things like indigenous crop varieties, right, or the collection of crop wild relatives, as well as kind of controlled breeding or common garden experiments where they may be monitoring how they're growing higher or lower, right, or with one application method or a different, right, maybe indigenous gardening versus industrial gardening. People are trying to address these issues, right? And INEA is particularly unique insofar as that they're talking with indigenous peoples about it, which is why Alvaro was so kind of keen, I think, to get in on this project. Because they've already had inroads with many indigenous communities, right? Looking not just to extract resources, right, but to work with people, right? Give them title necessarily over some of the resources they may be co-developing, and ultimately trying to solve these issues on more localized scales. Because one solution doesn't necessarily meet the needs of another area, right? Culture or economic kind of niche. That answer your question?
I'm curious, just in terms of climate change, we talk about change of environment, change of lifestyle, all of this kind of stuff. And one thing that's often skipped over, especially in our culture, is this conversation around death and mortality. And I'm curious if conversations around death and mortality came up in like this exploration and how that played into how people responded.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. it's like a common phrase basically in Quechua when you ask somebody how they're doing, if they're doing poorly, right? They just say "wanyun" or "wanyuni," which is just "I'm dying," right? And it took me several years to realize that it wasn't just like 50% of the people I know. In the background, slowly, of some cancer. I mean, I was scared for several years. The idea, though, is that they are keenly aware of death. I mean, how could you not be in an area where as soon as something ceases to live, right, everything around it starts decomposing it, right, and starting to utilize it to create new life. And I see that reutilized and kind of replicated in a lot of their worldviews and theories about things like climate change, right? The issue here is about some factors that there may be no precedent for, right? How do we explain something like nuclear radiation? How do we explain something like an atom bomb? Things that they've never experienced, right? They won't necessarily have the adequate verbiage to talk about in, just like we don't necessarily have the adequate verbiage to talk about, for an example, what the word yachak means, right? Shaman is often how it's glossed, right? But these are words with baggage, right? Just like when we want to use a pronoun in the world right now, those words have baggage. You can't just give somebody a pronoun, right? And just like can't give somebody a word without understanding the nuances that are attached to it. Yeah, in terms of, could you reiterate what you're saying, life and death, and how it was tied to?
Yeah, and how that kind of built its way into conversation.
Yeah, so a lot of times this is just in Amazonia, for those of you who may not be familiar, like in perhaps many indigenous communities, there's no accidents. Things don't just happen. Oops, granny died, my kid drowned. There's always something causing it, right? Now that cause could be supernatural. It could be that it's not a human. However, it often is somebody else that they're pointing a finger to, right? And so there's these chains of interrelationship stretching back decades, often related to death, right? Poisoning, right, due to oil pollution or extracting gold in someone else's river instead of your section of the river, right? Because you know what it's doing, and you just go down there, and all of a sudden someone else's kid is getting cancer and fingers are being pointed. That was a report. Things like, I don't know, big no-no, right? Now, historically you used to be able, I would imagine once upon a time, it may have been the case where people weren't always at these level of odds with their neighbors, but now certainly in an environment that demands so much cash, which is a scarce resource, right? For these environments that used to be able to produce all their own resources. When there's not enough money going around, fingers start getting pointed, right? And when death is involved and there's not a lot of money going around, more fingers start getting pointed. I think by and large, though, it was, I forget if it was your comment or Andrea's, most of these things weren't individuals, right? They weren't necessarily saying, you are the one that has caused my death. It's in aggregate. Yes, you're a contributor because you've poisoned my end of the river with your gold mining, but it's all of this. I know that it wasn't just that single usage, right? A lot of times they drink out, a lot of times they're aware that the things they're doing take multiple exposures, right? And they're aware that it's bad for them, right? Drinking out of old kerosene jugs is common, right? Washing out a kerosene jug as much as you can, wash out kerosene impregnated plastic jug and using it as a water container. They know that's bad, but it's a requirement for daily life when you don't have money, right? Or you're out in the middle of nowhere, or you're thirsty, right? So it's a common aspect interrelated to many of these different factors. Did that answer your question? So did you find that ecological knowledge is generational and goes further than colonial sciences cared to recognize? Yes, certainly. And this is a common thing about older generations talking with their children who now are being educated in school systems, which they know are important for getting those jobs that get them money, which is a requirement now. They also recognize that the downside to this is that they're not in the fields, right? Or not in the gardens, experientially learning, right? You can't tell somebody what a flower smells like, right? Nor can you adequately describe the texture of a diagnostic, type of tree bark, right? That's slightly furry and itchy at the same time. These require being in an area and being in a place to transfer those perceptive characteristics across generations. So older generations often lamented that the downside to children being in schools is that they weren't getting this information and that it was critically important, right? Nevertheless, for them to get this information. So yes, certainly many of them, when we talked about agricultural strategies, some kids who went to school for agriculture would say, look, mom and dad, this is something I've learned about fertilizer. And their dad's like, we've known that for like 1,000 years, kid. Just this is, a product that somebody has sold you, right? It can be made this way. So certainly, absolutely. And they're keenly aware of it in many respects, especially at older generations. Well, if that's all, I will leave you guys there. And once again, please just reach out if you have questions. I think my email might be in the call on the Prentice website, but I'm always keen to talk about this or collaborate, not just on climate change, but anything related to biological and cultural diversity intersections there.
So are you around?
I am. I'm around.
Are you in Lethbridge?
I am. I'm in Lethbridge. All right, let's stop the share.
Thanks a lot, John, and thank you everyone for making the time to attend today.